It's funny how something as enormous as a pyramid can still hide so many questions. You look at these giant stone triangles in the desert, 4,500 years old, still standing like they're waiting for someone to ask the right kind of question, and you can't help but wonder, how on earth did people build that without cranes, electricity, forklifts, or a boss yelling into a walkie-talkie? Tonight, we're going to settle into that world. A world of stone blocks heavier than cars, ancient workers who somehow figured out how to move them, and pharaohs who apparently wanted their tombs large enough to be seen from space. If you fall asleep to these videos, feel free to like and subscribe so you can find them again easily. And let me know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. Take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, adjust your pillows, and tuck yourself in. Let your breathing soften. Allow the day you had to fade a little as you shift into a slower rhythm. Now let's head into the sands of ancient Egypt, not by magic, not by time travel, but by understanding how real people, with real tools, built something the world still struggles to explain. When a pharaoh decided he wanted a pyramid, it wasn't a small announcement. He didn't walk into the palace one afternoon and casually say, "All right, everyone, I've been thinking. What if we stack millions of rocks into a giant triangle and put me inside it? Thoughts?" But that's more or less how it started. A pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a political statement, a religious symbol, a national construction project, and also, very importantly, a message saying, "My afterlife will be VIP. Yours will not." But the real challenge wasn't the spiritual part. It was the engineering part. Imagine telling people in the present day that you want to build something nearly 150 meters tall, using nothing but stone, ropes, wooden sleds, and human muscle. You'd probably get a few raised eyebrows, a long pause, and then someone asking, "Do you at least have coffee?" Ancient Egypt didn't. They had beer though, which, honestly, might have been even more helpful. So the very first problem the ancient builders faced was simple to describe, but impossible to ignore. How do you move millions of heavy stones? And heavy is an understatement. The average block used in the Great Pyramid weighs about 2.5 tons. Some weigh up to 80 tons. That's not the kind of thing you casually kick into place with a sandal. But before they even moved the stones, they needed the stones. Most of the blocks for the Great Pyramid came from right there on the Giza Plateau. That was convenient, sort of like building a house and realizing half the bricks are already in the backyard. Workers used copper chisels, stone hammers, and wooden wedges to cut the blocks. Nothing fancy. No diamond saws, no laser levels, just sweat, sand, and determination. Then there were the special stones, the smooth white casing stones that once covered the entire pyramid, making it shine like a giant, perfect triangle under the sun. Those came from across the Nile, from quarries at Tura, and the huge blocks used inside the pyramid, especially the massive granite beams above the king's chamber, came all the way from Aswan, about 800 kilometers upriver. 800 kilometers, using boats made of wood tied together with rope. No GPS, no engines, just river currents and a prayer that everything floated in the right direction. So the Egyptians had quarries, and they had stones. Now what? A lot of older stories claimed the pyramids were built by slaves, but archaeology paints a far different picture. At Giza, just outside the pyramids, archaeologists found tombs for the workers, not the kind of thing you build for slaves. They found bakeries, workshops, homes, and even records showing workers rotated in teams, with names like the Friends of Khufu Gang. Yes, pyramid construction teams had group names, like ancient Egyptian bowling teams, but stronger. These workers were skilled, organized, fed well, and medically cared for. They weren't forced. They were part of a national project meant to honor the pharaoh and, quite possibly, to secure a good job with great bread rations. Because bread and beer were standard payment. You build a pyramid, you get carbs. Not a bad deal. So, how do you drag a giant rock? This is the part that surprises people. But it's also one of the most confirmed techniques. You put the stone on a wooden sled. You pour water on the sand in front of it. And then you drag it. It sounds like nothing. but tests show that dragging a sled over wet sand reduces friction by up to 50%. Ancient Egyptians even drew this method on the walls of tombs. One painting shows a man pouring water in front of a sled carrying a huge statue. Water was their WD-40. Teams of men, usually 20 to 40, would pull a stone across the desert using rope, timing their steps so the sled glided over the damp sand. Of course, not every pull went smoothly. Sometimes a stone got stuck. Sometimes it was too heavy. Sometimes someone probably complained loudly, but history did not record that part. To make a pyramid, you needed thousands of workers, hundreds of overseers, food for everyone, water for the sand and the people, quarrying tools, boats for transport, carpenters to make sleds, rope makers, scribes to record everything, and guards to make sure no one wandered off and hid behind a palm tree. Pyramid building wasn't done by an army of workers living on site year-round. It relied on rotating crews, often farmers who worked on the pyramids during the flood season when their fields were underwater. Think of it like ancient Egypt's biggest seasonal job. Limited time offer, free beer included. And all of this, every rope, every loaf of bread, every drop of water, had to be perfectly planned. If one supply line failed, the whole project stalled. Still, somehow, they made it work. Stone after stone, layer after layer, and with every block they dragged across the desert, the shape of the pyramid slowly began to rise. Once the Egyptians figured out how to get stones out of the ground, onto sleds, across sand, onto boats, off boats, and up to the base of the pyramid, they faced their next major issue: how to lift each block higher than the one before it. Building the first couple of layers wasn't difficult. Those stones could simply be slid into place with a bit of teamwork and some very determined shouting from supervisors. But soon, the structure grew too tall for simple pushing. The pyramid shape began rising like a giant staircase, and every new row needed to be placed above the last. That meant lifting heavy stone blocks higher and higher, without cranes, pulleys, or any machine more advanced than a wooden beam. So the big question became, how do you move massive blocks upward in a world where the wheel isn't widely used yet? The Egyptians came up with the same idea most people still use today when moving heavy furniture: build a ramp. The only issue was that a ramp big enough to reach the top of a pyramid would be absolutely enormous. If they built one straight ramp from the ground to the top, it could stretch for kilometers and require more material than the pyramid itself. And nobody, not even a pharaoh, wanted to build a pyramid in order to build a ramp to build another pyramid. Some early Egyptologists insisted the Egyptians must have done it anyway. They imagined a long, straight ramp stretching across the desert like a giant stone slide. It made sense on paper until people actually did the math and realized it would turn the entire Giza plateau into one gigantic construction ramp. And even then, the ramp would be so steep that workers dragging a block up, it might as well try pulling the moon down from the sky. A straight ramp simply didn't seem like the right answer. So theories began branching in different directions. Some suggested that the Egyptians built a zigzag ramp along one side of the pyramid. As the structure grew taller, the ramp grew longer, wrapping back and forth like a giant stone switchback trail. It seemed more efficient and easier to maintain. But there was a new problem. If the ramp hugged the outer walls too much, it would block access to the surfaces that needed to stay flat and smooth. You can't polish limestone if your giant ramp is leaning on it. Then came the spiral ramp theory. Imagine a ribbon wrapping around the pyramid, circling upward layer by layer. On this ramp, workers could drag blocks around the structure until they reached the top. It sounded neat, but it raised an important question. How do you build a perfectly straight pyramid if you can't see the corners because a ramp is wrapped around them? Nobody wants to finish a decades-long project only to climb down, look at their masterpiece from the desert floor, and realize it leans to the left. More recently, a different idea gathered attention, one that archaeologists and engineers started to take seriously: Maybe the Egyptians didn't build a massive ramp outside the pyramid at all. Maybe they built smaller ramps inside it. Some researchers think there could have been an internal system of corridors or ramps built in sections along the edges of the structure. Workers could haul blocks upward through these hidden passageways, shielded from the sun and wind. It's a clever idea because it solves many problems at once. It doesn't hide the corners, it doesn't require a ramp the size of another pyramid, and it matches some unusual features inside the Great Pyramid: spaces, odd-angled corridors, and mysterious voids discovered by modern scanning techniques. Some of these voids look exactly like places where large stones might have been turned or stored during the climb upward. No single theory has been proven beyond doubt, but one thing is clear. The Egyptians were not guessing. They had practical engineering knowledge built up through centuries of experience. Before the Great Pyramid, earlier pyramids show clear signs of trial and error. They tried steep sides, and those collapsed. They tried building on weak ground, and those cracked. They tried changing designs halfway through, and those leaned so badly they practically apologized for existing. By the time Khufu ordered the Great Pyramid, the Egyptians had learned from every mistake their ancestors made. They had worked out angles, weight distribution, foundation placement, and the best construction materials. And they had the most valuable resource of all: thousands of workers who did this type of labor every year during the flood season. They were not weekend volunteers. They were professionals. Whatever ramp system they used, straight, zigzag, spiral, internal, or a clever mix of several, what mattered most was organization. If one team pulled too early, the sled jerked. If one team pulled too late, the stone twisted. Everything depended on timing. A block couldn't move up the pyramid until the previous team had placed the foundation stones correctly. Workers on the ground had to keep sleds repaired, ropes fresh, and sand wet. Overseers had to coordinate shifts so that nobody collapsed from exhaustion in the sun. It wasn't chaos. It was ancient project management with a level of efficiency that makes modern construction look like it's powered by a series of polite guesses. The higher the pyramid grew, the more the desert became a network of teams all working on different sections at once. Some were cutting stone, some were dragging sleds, some were smoothing limestone, some were repairing tools, some were cooking bread and brewing beer. It was one of the earliest examples of a giant workforce functioning like a machine, every part operating independently, but connected to the same enormous goal. When the pyramid reached its final height, placing the top stone, called the capstone, was almost ceremonial. It was the last heavy block to be lifted, shaped perfectly, angled precisely, and set into place so the entire structure formed a flawless geometric point. After that, the hard work shifted from building upward to polishing outward. Workers removed the ramps, smoothed the outer casing stones, and finished the pyramid's gleaming surface. In the desert sun, the final product shined so brightly it reflected light for miles. Travelers approaching the Nile Valley would see 3 giant triangles glowing like white gold above the horizon. And when everything was finally done, the workers packed up their tools, finished their beer rations, and returned to their villages until the next pharaoh decided to build something that would absolutely ruin everyone's knees again. Once people accept that the Egyptians didn't use lasers, anti-gravity, or an army of polite aliens, the next question is always the same. How did they transport all those stones from the quarries to the construction site? Because getting a 2.5-ton block out of a quarry is one thing. Getting it from that quarry to a pyramid, across hot sand, uneven terrain, and occasionally the entire Nile River, is something else entirely. The Egyptians, however, were masters of something most people overlook: logistics. They weren't simply stacking stones. They were moving them like pieces in a giant desert puzzle, each one needing to arrive at exactly the right time and place. The first part of the journey happened right at the quarry. Workers would carve the block out of the stone bed by cutting grooves around it using copper chisels, wooden wedges, and stone hammers. Once the block was loosened, they'd jam wooden levers beneath it and rock it back and forth until it broke free. It's easy to imagine a group of workers grunting in unison, probably in a rhythm coordinated by a supervisor who, in another life, might have made a great modern fitness instructor. As soon as the block was free, they'd lower it onto a wooden sled. The sled was nothing more than a simple platform with curved runners, but it was sturdy and designed to slide over sand when the sand was prepared correctly. That preparation was key. Dry sand grabs onto anything that moves through it, which is wonderful if you're trying to build a sandcastle, but terrible if you're dragging a multi-ton stone across a desert. Wet sand, however, behaves differently. Pouring just the right amount of water onto it makes the grains stick together, reducing friction so the sled glides more easily. This wasn't a lucky guess or a miracle discovery. The Egyptians actually painted pictures of men pouring water in front of sleds to help move statues and stones. They knew what they were doing. It was tested, it was repeated, and it worked. The next step was getting the stones across land to the Nile. Some quarries were very close to the river. Others were farther away, requiring longer journeys. But the pattern was always the same. A team of workers, usually between 20 and 40, would pull the sled while another team prepared the sand. Overseers stood nearby, sometimes counting steps or calling commands. If one side of the sled dragged more than the other, they'd adjust ropes or add more workers. The Egyptians understood that balance mattered. A lopsided sled could twist, get stuck, or even tip over, and nobody wanted to be the person explaining that accident to a supervisor. Once the stones reached the Nile, they faced the next stage of their journey: water transport. This part often surprises people. You would think moving huge stones by boat would be a nightmare, but the Nile was the ancient world's greatest highway. Boats were built wide and strong, with wooden planks tied together using rope and wooden pegs. They weren't fancy, but they floated well and could hold massive weight. Workers would push the sleds onto the deck, secure them tightly, and then let the river do most of the work. During the flood season, the Nile swelled and spread across the land. Fields disappeared underwater, but that actually made construction easier. When the river rose, boats could get closer to the pyramid site, reducing the distance stones had to be dragged on land. It was almost like nature giving the workers a break for a few months. Instead of hauling blocks across dry, dusty terrain, they could float them directly to temporary canals, built just for this purpose. These canals led to harbor-like basins near the construction area. Archaeologists recently discovered parts of these ancient waterways, evidence that the Egyptians intentionally shaped the land to make pyramid building easier. When the boats arrived, workers unloaded the blocks, slid them back onto sleds, and dragged them to where the ramps began. All of this took planning, serious planning. You couldn't have too many stones arriving at once, or they'd pile up and block pathways. Too few, and workers on the ramps would run out of materials. Every part of the process had to line up, and this was done without computers, radios, or even a chalkboard with a to-do list. Instead, scribes recorded daily activities on papyrus, noted stone deliveries, tracked worker rotations, and made sure each block got to where it needed to go. Speaking of worker rotations, the labor force didn't stay the same year-round. Many workers were farmers who came to help during the flood season when their fields were underwater. That meant thousands of strong, healthy people were suddenly available and motivated. Working for the state was a way to earn food, earn respect, and earn a permanent connection to the pharaoh. Each worker belonged to a team, and each team had a name. Sometimes these names were proudly carved onto the stones they helped move. It was a way to say, "We were here. We built this." Workers lived in organized villages near the construction site. These settlements had bakeries, fish preparation areas, breweries, workshops, dormitories, and even medical centers. Injuries were treated. Broken bones were set. Bread and beer were distributed daily. All of this points to one thing: the workers were valued. People don't build a city within a city for slaves. They build it for people they depend on. Imagine the daily scene around the pyramid base. You'd see long lines of workers dragging sleds, supervisors calling instructions, carpenters repairing broken sled parts, rope makers twisting fresh rope from plant fibers, and bakers kneading dough for the next meal. The air would smell like bread, fish, smoke from cooking fires, and dust. Everywhere you looked, there was motion. Nothing was random. Every person had a purpose. Once the stones reached the base of the pyramid, they were sorted. Some were destined for the outer walls, others for the interior chambers. The most special blocks, like granite from Aswan, were reserved for rooms deep inside the structure. Placing those heavy, dark red blocks required even more careful coordination. Teams would prepare long, smooth paths so these massive pieces could be moved without cracking. Step by step, stone by stone, the pyramid grew. From the outside, it might have looked chaotic, a sea of workers, ramps, ropes, and dust. But underneath the noise and movement was a sophisticated system. The Egyptians understood how to maximize human strength, how to use the environment to their advantage, and how to maintain constant progress without burning out their workforce. In many ways, the real marvel of the pyramids isn't just the architecture, it's the logistics behind it. The transportation network that connected quarries, boats, canals, workers, ramps, and the construction site is one of the most impressive achievements in human history. Every stone had a journey. Every journey was planned. And every plan was part of something much larger than any one person. If you stood at the Giza Plateau during pyramid construction, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the massive stones, or the shining limestone, or even the ramps that snaked around the rising structure. The first thing your eyes would catch was people, thousands of them. The entire project functioned like a human machine, each worker a moving part of something far bigger than themselves. The old stereotype claims a group of tired, sunburned slaves dragged stones under the whip of cruel overseers. But archaeology has slowly torn that image apart piece by piece. The people who built the pyramids were not slaves. They were skilled laborers, specialists, seasonal farmers, craftsmen, team leaders, rope makers, bakers, brewers, stone cutters, engineers, and everyone in between. The pyramids didn't rise from misery. They rose from teamwork, pride, good organization, and an astonishing amount of bread. Bread and beer were the fuel of ancient Egyptian labor. Every day, workers received rations that kept them strong while controlling how much they could complain. After all, it's hard to grumble too loudly when you're holding a fresh loaf under one arm and a clay jug of beer under the other. People don't talk enough about this, but beer was basically the ancient Egyptian version of employee motivation. It was thick, filling, nutritious, and safe to drink, which is more than you can say for much of the water near the Nile at certain times of the year. The workers didn't sleep in holes or on the bare sand. They lived in organized villages built right beside the pyramid construction sites. These worker towns had proper houses made of mud brick, with shared courtyards, storage rooms, bakeries that produced thousands of loaves a day, and massive ovens that never cooled. There were butchers who processed cattle, fish, preparation areas, and even breweries that bubbled non-stop. The most surprising part? There were medical centers. Archaeologists found evidence that workers received bone-setting treatments, surgery for injuries, and care for infections. People with healed fractures, some quite severe, were found buried with respect near the pyramids. That kind of medical attention isn't something you give to slaves. That's what you give to a workforce you rely on. The social structure of the labor teams was impressive. Workers were divided into groups called files, each with its own identity. These files were divided further into smaller crews, often with creative names carved into the blocks they moved. Names like the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure, and, my personal favorite, the Vigorous Gang. Imagine hauling a 2-ton block uphill and proudly carving your team name into it like you're signing a yearbook. The pharaoh may have ordered the pyramid, but the people who built it also left their mark, literally. These graffiti marks weren't vandalism, they were pride. It's the ancient version of construction workers today, writing their names inside the walls of new buildings, knowing no one may see them again. But the signature still matters. Each team had specific roles. Some groups focused on quarrying the stone, others specialized in dragging sleds, some built ramps, others smoothed the limestone casing. Some workers measured angles and checked alignment so the pyramid wouldn't tilt or twist. Even in a world without modern tools, the Egyptians had specialists for everything. Farmers joined the workforce during the flood season, when the Nile water covered their fields and made farming impossible. Instead of staying home and complaining about the weather, like most of us modern people, they joined massive national projects. The flood season turned the Nile Valley into a place of opportunity. While the river rested, the farmers worked on pyramids, canals, temples, and other state projects. This created a cycle, where building became part of the rhythm of life. Picture the scene. At sunrise, teams gathered around hauling points. Some were rolling their shoulders, stretching or splashing water on their faces. Others were tying rope or repairing worn wooden sled parts. Overseers checked the teams, making sure everyone was ready before giving the signal. When the command came, dozens of workers leaned forward in perfect coordination. Their sandals dug into the sand. Ropes tightened. The sled creaked as it began to slide. Sand hissed beneath the runners as the water carriers poured perfectly measured amounts ahead of the sled. Every movement mattered. If one group pulled too fast, the sled jerked. If a rope snapped, the entire block might shift sideways and ruin hours of work. Each team learned to move as one. There's no modern word for the kind of coordination they achieved, but impressive doesn't even begin to cover it. Farther away, craftspeople hammered copper chisels into shape, sharpening edges dull from hours of cutting stone. Nearby, carpenters shaped wooden beams and reinforced sled runners. Rope makers soaked plant fibers, twisted them into cords, and tested them by pulling until they almost snapped. Everything had to be strong, because nothing ruins a workday like your rope breaking halfway up a ramp and sending a giant stone sliding back down at terrifying speed. Bakers kneaded dough from dawn until long after sunset. Some of the ovens uncovered near Giza are big enough to fit several people inside, though baking bread inside one of those probably would have been discouraged. They produced bread by the thousands to keep up with demand. Beer brewers were equally busy, mixing barley, water, and yeast in huge vats and letting the mixture bubble into rich, nutritious beer. It wasn't the kind of beer people drink today. It was thick and almost chewy, but it gave workers the strength they needed. The overseers, who probably slept with a constant headache, tracked everything: number of blocks quarried, number delivered, number placed, number of workers on each shift, and which teams performed best. They weren't just shouting orders. They were running one of the largest construction management operations in human history. When the sun reached its highest point, workers rested in whatever shade they could find, usually behind large stones or under temporary awnings. They ate bread, onions, dried fish, and dates. They drank water and beer. They shared jokes, complained about the heat, teased each other about who dragged blocks the slowest that morning. Some cleaned their tools. Others simply lay down and stared at the sky. Then, when the heat softened a bit, they returned to the ramps and hauled until the sun dipped into the horizon. The pyramid grew one block at a time, but it was the workers who made it possible. Their strength shaped the stone. Their organization shaped the schedule. Their pride shaped the history. Without them, the desert would still be empty. When the day finally ended, workers returned to their homes in the village. Fires lit the settlement, flickering against mud brick walls. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted through the night as people rested, healed, and prepared for the next day's labor. And so the pyramid rose, powered not by magic or mystery, but by thousands of hands working together. A human puzzle solved step by step. Before a single stone was dragged, cut, or stacked, the Egyptians needed a plan, not a vague idea, not a sketch in the sand that someone rubbed out by accident, but a true blueprint for what would become the most precisely constructed structure of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid wasn't built by people guessing angles or eyeballing measurements. If they had tried that, the pyramid would have looked more like a lopsided sandcastle than a geometric masterpiece. Instead, the Egyptians relied on some of the most advanced surveying and planning techniques of their time. The first step in construction wasn't quarrying stone, it was finding the perfect spot. The Giza Plateau wasn't chosen at random. It had the right type of limestone bedrock, solid, level, and strong enough to support millions of tons of stone without sinking or warping. The Egyptians understood their land. They knew which places cracked, which places shifted, and which ones would hold a structure steady for thousands of years. Giza was ideal. High ground, stable rock, and close enough to the Nile to transport materials easily. Once the site was chosen, the next challenge was orientation. The Egyptians wanted the pyramid to align perfectly with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Not close enough, not kind of facing north. They wanted precision, and somehow, without compasses or GPS, they achieved an accuracy so sharp that even modern surveyors are impressed. The sides of the Great Pyramid are aligned to true north within a tiny fraction of a degree. How did they do it? They used the sky. The night sky was their compass, their calendar, and their clock. Astronomer priests observed the stars, especially the ones that circled the north celestial pole. By tracking the movement of these stars and marking where they rose and set, the Egyptians could determine true north with incredible accuracy. They likely set up long sighting rods or stretched rope lines across the ground to fix the orientation. Once the alignment was established, they could mark the corners of the pyramid with wooden stakes and then lay out perfectly straight lines with ropes pulled taut by teams of skilled measurers. These measurers, the rope stretchers, were the ancient world's surveyors. They walked with ropes made of tightly woven plant fibers, carefully stretched to eliminate slack. These ropes ensured that each side of the pyramid remained straight and accurate. Rope stretchers appear in ancient paintings with their tools: wooden pegs, ropes, plumb bobs, leveling instruments, and measuring rods. They weren't just workers. They were specialists whose job required steady hands and mathematical awareness. When the outline was marked, the Egyptians created a perfectly level foundation. This is a detail many modern builders still admire. Leveling the base of the pyramid to such an exact degree was no small task. Workers dug shallow trenches, filled them with water, and observed where the water sat. Water always finds a level surface, so it became the most reliable tool for achieving a flat base. Wherever the water touched the trench corners evenly, they carved the stone to match that height. They repeated this process over the entire foundation until the entire base was nearly perfect. Only then could the real construction begin. The next major challenge was deciding the pyramid's angle. The Egyptians experimented with pyramid angles for centuries. Early pyramids, like the famous bent pyramid at Dashur, proved that steep sides could cause cracking and collapse. So by the time Khufu's builders started work on the Great Pyramid, they knew what angles were stable and what angles were risky. They settled on a slope of about 51 degrees, a strong, balanced angle that gave the pyramid its iconic shape. The shape wasn't chosen lightly. A pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a symbol of the sun's rays, believed to lift the pharaoh's soul into the heavens. Its shape echoed the mound of creation, what the Egyptians believed rose from the waters of chaos at the beginning of the world. So yes, the angles mattered in both engineering and meaning. Inside the pyramid, the design was even more complex. The builders had to plan the internal chambers and passageways before construction ever started. These rooms weren't added afterward like bonus features. They were part of the original plan. The king's chamber, made of enormous granite blocks from Aswan, required its own architectural preparation. The builders needed to predict how much weight would press on the chamber from above, so they added relieving spaces, small rooms stacked above it to spread out the force and prevent collapse. These weren't decorative spaces. They were structural genius. Then came the Grand Gallery, a massive sloping corridor with perfectly aligned walls rising dozens of meters inside the pyramid. This passage wasn't just a walkway. It was an architectural marvel requiring precise geometry and stable support. The Egyptians didn't build it by guessing. They measured every angle. They set every block so tightly that the joints still hold today without mortar. Before construction even began, the entire pyramid existed first as measurements, plans, and calculations in the minds of the architects and engineers. The Egyptians didn't sketch blueprints on paper, but they communicated designs orally and through models. They used cubits, forearm-length measurements, to maintain consistent dimensions. One royal cubit was standardized, and measuring rods carved from wood or stone kept everything aligned. Imagine the planning meetings. A group of architects, priests, engineers, and overseers gathered around the pharaoh's representatives, probably pointing at sand diagrams, explaining why one chamber needed to be deeper or why a passage should slope at a certain angle. Somewhere in that group was a person whose job title we might call something like Chief Pyramid Mathematician, and you can be sure they took their job very seriously. If a mistake happened on paper, it could ruin decades of work in stone. Even the ramps were part of the plan from the beginning. Whether the builders used straight ramps, zigzag ramps, spiral ramps, or internal ramps, they had to be designed so workers could move stones continuously. The ramps needed to be strong enough to hold the weight of the sleds, wide enough for teams to maneuver, and stable enough to be rebuilt as the pyramid grew taller. A poorly planned ramp would collapse under its own weight. The Egyptians simply could not afford to improvise these things halfway through construction. Coordinating all these parts required a strong administrative network. Scribes recorded every detail: stone deliveries, worker assignments, tool repairs, food distribution, and construction progress. They were the managers who kept the entire project from falling into chaos. Without them, even the best engineers would have been buried under disorganized stone piles. The blueprint of the Great Pyramid wasn't just a physical layout. It was a complete system: mathematical, logistical, architectural, and symbolic. Every chamber, every corridor, every angle served a purpose. And each purpose was tied to the central belief that the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife depended on this structure being perfect. With a clear plan in place, with workers ready, with materials prepared, and with the pharaoh's order echoing through the kingdom, the construction began. But even with planning, building a mountain of stone would push human limits in ways no other ancient project ever had. When most people picture the pyramids being built, they imagine workers piling stones in a chaotic stack, like someone throwing laundry into a corner and hoping it turns into a perfect triangle. But the Egyptians didn't build that way. The pyramid didn't grow randomly. It grew in tidy layers, one on top of another, each one measured, leveled, and locked into place with precision that still puzzles modern engineers. The foundation was set. The corners were aligned. The plan was ready. Now came the part that turned a flat design into a three-dimensional wonder, laying the stones in rows. The pyramid was built in horizontal layers, called courses. Each course had to be completed before workers could move to the next one. Think of it like baking a cake, except every ingredient weighs more than a car and requires you to yell at 30 people to pull harder on the rope. The lower courses were the biggest, using the largest stones. These formed the base, and they needed to be so stable that nothing above would shift or sink. As the pyramid rose, the stones on the outer layers gradually became smaller. This wasn't laziness, it was strategy. Heavier stones at lower levels improved stability, while smaller stones above made maneuvering easier. Every stone had a place. Before workers dragged a block into position, someone marked exactly where it would go. A team of planners measured distances, angles, and heights, using tools made of wood, rope, and stone. They didn't use mortar to glue stones together. Instead, they relied on precise cutting to ensure stones fit tightly. When a block didn't fit perfectly, and mistakes did happen, stonemasons shaped it on the spot until it slid into position with barely a gap. If you could travel back in time and watch a mason examine a block, you'd see him run his hands over the edges, chip away imperfections, wipe sand off the surface, and nod sharply when the fit felt right. Perfect fit, perfect hold. The outer casing stones required even more attention. These were the smooth white limestone blocks meant to give the pyramid its flawless, shining appearance. Each casing stone had a slight inward angle to create the pyramid's slope. If this angle was wrong by even a tiny amount, the structure's geometry could warp by the time it reached the top. Casing stones were placed only after the rough core blocks were already stacked behind them. Workers lifted these polished stones into place with ramps, levers, and a lot of coordination. Once set, they were smoothed even more to create an outer surface that caught the sun like a polished mirror. Inside the pyramid, blocks were arranged differently. The builders used massive blocks of limestone for walls, granite beams for ceilings, and limestone filler stones to create corridors. Some of these internal stones were so heavy that even modern cranes would groan at the idea of lifting them. The granite beams above the king's chamber are a perfect example. Each one is about 80 tons, and they were lifted roughly 40 meters above the ground. Nobody knows the exact method they used, but they did it. And they did it without cracking a single beam. The ramps played a major role in getting stones up to higher levels. While historians still debate the exact shape of the ramps, everyone agrees they were constantly rebuilt and extended as the pyramid grew. Workers didn't build one long ramp and leave it there for 20 years. Instead, they adapted. When one layer was completed, ramps were lengthened or repositioned so stones could reach the next height. Some ramps may have spiraled around the pyramid. Some may have been internal. Others may have zigzagged up one face. The Egyptians weren't rigid. They adjusted strategies depending on what worked. The Fazhit. Ramps weren't just about lifting stones. They were roads. Hundreds of workers traveled up and down them every day carrying tools, food, water, ropes, wooden beams, baskets, and messages. The ramps were the highways of Giza, connecting the ground to the growing height of the pyramid. They needed constant maintenance. Sand had to be brushed off, cracks had to be filled, sled paths had to be kept smooth. Imagine the frustration of a worker dragging a block only for the sled to catch on a rough spot. You would definitely hear some muttering. Communication was vital. Workers couldn't just drag a stone and hope everyone around them magically knew what to do. Overseers shouted commands to keep everyone synchronized. A team of rope pullers tugged in rhythm. Someone gave signals to start pulling. Someone else warned when the sled needed straightening. If the block hit a bump, workers quickly wedged wooden beams underneath to keep it from tipping. A stone wasn't placed until every person involved agreed it was safe. Once the stone reached the correct height, the final push began. Workers wedged wooden levers beneath it and heaved, shifting the stone inch by inch into its exact spot. Levers were the unsung heroes of pyramid construction. A simple wooden beam could lift a massive block when used correctly. A worker inserted the lever under the stone, leaned on it, and shifted the block upward, while another worker slid a small stone or wedge underneath. They repeated this movement again and again, lift, wedge, until the block was finally level with the course and could be slid into place with a final shove. As the pyramid rose, the view from the top must have been incredible. Workers could look out across the entire Nile Valley. They'd see fields, trees, boats on the river, and the desert stretching out for miles. Imagine being the worker chosen to stand at the highest point so far, waiting for a new block to arrive. There's no written record of what they said at moments like that, but it was probably something like, "Please don't drop it." Dust was everywhere. Stonecutters created clouds of limestone as they chipped. Rope pullers kicked up sand. Carpenters sawed wood. The wind blew grit across the ramps. Workers sweat under the heat, and the smell of baking bread drifted from the village below. The air was dry, warm, and filled with the sounds of hammering, shouting, dragging, and work songs. that kept teams pulling in time. Every so often, supervisors checked measurements. They walked the edges, measured the angles, made sure the faces were straight, and confirmed the top was level. Accuracy mattered. If a layer leaned a little too far inward or outward, the mistake would grow as the structure rose. The Egyptians were careful. They checked everything twice, maybe 3 times, and corrected errors quickly. And so the pyramid climbed skyward, one layer at a time. With each completed course, workers stepped back to admire their progress. They didn't see the full pyramid yet, only the part directly in front of them. But even a small glimpse of the growing structure must have inspired them. They were building something greater than themselves, a monument meant to outlive kingdoms, wars, rulers, and even time itself. When people think of the pyramids, they imagine huge stones, huge ramps, and huge crowds of workers. What they often forget are the small things, tools, measurements, tricks, and techniques that made those huge achievements possible. Without the right tools, even thousands of workers can't do much more than sweat impressively in the sun. So let's talk about the technology behind the wonder, the ropes, chisels, levels, levers, and clever methods that turned raw stone into a masterpiece. First, let's talk about the tools themselves. Egyptian workers didn't have iron during the time of the Great Pyramid. They relied mostly on copper and stone. Copper is softer than iron, so chisels and saws lost their edges quickly. But the Egyptians knew this. They weren't shocked when a tool dulled after carving through rock. They expected it. That's why toolmakers were always busy nearby, sharpening and reshaping copper blades, heating them in small furnaces, and hammering them back into useful form. A worker might go through several chisels in a single day. That was simply part of the job. For cutting softer stones like limestone, copper tools worked fine. For the tougher granite used in the inner chambers, workers used harder stones like dolerite, basically giant pounding balls. Imagine someone holding a round black stone the size of a watermelon and smashing it into granite all day. Not glamorous, but it works. Archaeologists found huge piles of worn dolerite pounding stones near the quarries, each one shaped by thousands of hits. Now, how did they measure things so precisely? The Egyptians didn't eyeball their angles. They used measuring rods marked with cubits, the length of a forearm, and shorter segments called palms and digits. These rods were carved with careful markings, straight, even, and easy to read. It sounds simple, but consistency mattered. Imagine using one rod that measured 52 centimeters and another that measured 48 because someone carved it on a Monday morning before coffee. That would be a disaster. The Egyptians standardized the cubit to avoid exactly that problem. For leveling, they used water. One of the simplest tools they had was a water-filled trench. When water sits still, its surface becomes perfectly level. By marking where the water touched, workers carved the ground to match that line. They also used plumb bobs, weights hanging from strings, to check vertical lines. If a plumb bob swung straight down, they knew the wall was aligned correctly. These tools may sound basic compared to modern equipment, but the results speak for themselves. Thousands of years later, the pyramids still stand, still, straight, still aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. Then there were ropes. Strong ropes were the backbone of pyramid construction. Without ropes, you couldn't transport stones, lift sleds, or secure loads on boats. Egyptian rope makers used plant fibers like papyrus, palm, and flax. They soaked the fibers, twisted them tightly, and braided them into long, thick ropes that could handle massive weight. These ropes weren't decorative. They were life-saving. A snapped rope could cause injury, delay construction, or send a stone sliding down a ramp like a giant, dangerous sled. Rope makers tested their products constantly, pulling with groups of men until the fibers nearly gave out. If the rope held, it was good enough for the day. Now let's talk about what happened when a stone reached its intended position. How did workers make sure it lined up with the ones beside it? The Egyptians used a clever trick. They prepared the surfaces of each stone so that they weren't perfectly flat, but slightly rough. When two stones with rough surfaces met, they gripped each other more tightly, preventing sliding. And they did all this without mortar between most blocks. The weight alone kept everything locked together once the stones were aligned. Sometimes, though, they used gypsum plaster as a kind of filler, not to glue stones together, but to fill tiny gaps and smooth imperfections so the final surface would sit perfectly even. This was especially important for the outer casing stones. Those needed to fit together tightly because the smooth outer surface defined the pyramid's iconic shape. Inside the pyramid, things got even more complicated. The corridors, chambers, and passageways required precise angles and smooth walls. Workers used straight edges, chalk, and cords to lay out lines on the stone before cutting. A line drawn incorrectly inside the pyramid wasn't just a small mistake. It could throw off the entire structure. So inside the pyramid, precision was absolute. One wrong angle could ruin months of effort. Every cut had to match the architect's plan exactly. Let's look at one of the most impressive parts of the pyramid, the king's chamber. This room was constructed entirely out of granite blocks from Aswan, and these blocks weren't just walls, they were enormous beams, used to create a layered ceiling system. Workers had to lift these beams up the ramps, and then slowly maneuver them into a small, confined area deep inside the pyramid. Once the beams were in place, workers had to be sure the weight of the pyramid above wouldn't crush the room. Their solution: the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. These were small rooms stacked on top of each other, each with large stones positioned to spread the weight horizontally instead of letting it press directly downward. And then there's the grand gallery. This massive internal ramp is one of the most precise and complex features in the entire pyramid. Its corbelled walls rise in a perfect slope, forming a long, narrow staircase-like structure that expands upward as it goes. The measurements inside the grand gallery are so exact that modern engineers still struggle to understand how the Egyptians maintained such consistency in the dim interior with simple lamps and hand tools. But they did. The gallery stands today just as it did thousands of years ago, with its angled walls and perfectly placed stone ledges. It wasn't just stonework and tools that made the pyramid possible. The workers used clever strategies to conserve energy and avoid mistakes. For example, they might lay out a path for dragging sleds so the incline wasn't too steep. If an incline was too sharp, the entire workforce could get stuck, pushing and pulling with no success, wasting the day. Instead, they carefully planned routes so workers had the best chance of success. They also stored tools in organized piles, ready for the next team. If a rope frayed, it was replaced immediately. If a stone hit a bump on the ramp, workers fixed the bump before the next team arrived. This constant attention to detail kept the work moving. Some of the most interesting discoveries are the marks left by workers. On stones inside the pyramid and in the relieving chambers, archaeologists found red ink markings, notes from the builders. These weren't poetic messages but practical instructions: where a block should go, which team placed it, which direction it should face. These markings show us that the Egyptians had a system, an internal communication network carved directly into stone. Tools didn't make the pyramid alone, people did. But without those tools, the work would have taken centuries instead of decades. The Egyptians understood their materials, their tools, and their environment. They knew how to use water, stone, rope, wood, copper, and muscle as effectively as possible. And each clever trick, each tool, each method contributed to the most impressive construction project in human history. Even with all the tools, tricks, and teamwork in the world, there remained one problem that would have made even the most dedicated ancient engineer rub his forehead and sigh. Some of the stones inside the Great Pyramid were simply enormous. Not just heavy, not just difficult, but the kind of heavy that makes you question your entire career path. These weren't the standard 2.5-ton blocks used for most of the pyramid. The granite beams used inside the king's chamber weighed up to 80 tons each. These were the giants of the project, huge, dense, and stubbornly unwilling to move. The Egyptians needed these granite beams to form the ceiling of the king's chamber and to create the relieving spaces above it. Without them, the chamber would have collapsed under the weight of millions of tons of limestone overhead. The granite beams had to be perfect. No cracks, no flaws, no weaknesses. And once quarried in Aswan, they had to be transported 800 kilometers upriver, moved across land, dragged up ramps, maneuvered into the pyramid, lifted into place, and set precisely into the structure. One beam out of line could ruin the entire room and delay construction for months. All those details matter here, because lifting these giant beams wasn't just about brute strength, it was about thinking smarter, not just harder. Picture the scene. A granite beam the size of a small bus lies on a sled near the base of the pyramid. Workers gather in teams, ropes coiled around their shoulders, wooden levers ready. The overseer calls the rhythm, the rope pullers lean forward, and the sled begins to slide. The first part of the journey is always the most important. If the stone gets stuck, everything behind it slows down. If it moves too quickly, it becomes dangerous. So teams moved in careful unison, step by step, until the sled reached the start of the ramps. This is where theories differ. Some say the Egyptians used a long, straight ramp on one side of the pyramid, gradually rising as the structure grew. Others believe they built shorter, zigzag ramps that switched direction as they went upward. Still others propose a spiral ramp wrapped around the pyramid like a coiling staircase. And a modern idea suggests something more clever: internal ramps hidden inside the structure, allowing stones to be raised without blocking the outer walls. But whatever method they used, it needed to support not just the weight of a standard block, but the massive weight of these granite beams. One of the most widely supported ideas is that workers didn't drag these huge stones all the way to the top in one go. Instead, they likely lifted them in stages. Imagine a platform, then a ramp, then another platform, and so on. The granite beam would be pulled up a small incline, dragged onto a landing, then shifted sideways into position for the next lift. This kind of step-by-step method made the impossible manageable. It also reduced the angle of the ramps. A steep ramp is a nightmare when pulling a heavy sled. A gentle incline, extended across multiple stages, is much more practical. Another idea suggests that the Egyptians used something similar to a counterweight. Workers might have dragged a heavy load of materials down one side of a ramp, pulling up the granite beam on the opposite side. Think of it like an ancient elevator without cables or pulleys. The Egyptians didn't leave written instructions saying, "We definitely used counterweights," but they did understand balance, load-bearing, and weight distribution. They built obelisks, weighing hundreds of tons, raised colossal statues, and moved enormous stone sarcophagi with incredible care. They knew how to use weight to their advantage. Inside the pyramid, workers also made clever use of levers. A wooden lever may not sound impressive, but when used correctly, a single lever can move a massive stone a few centimeters at a time. And in stonework, a few centimeters can change everything. Workers would lift one side of the beam with levers, wedge small stones beneath it, then lift again. Repeating that process allowed them to raise a stone gradually, without overwhelming force. This technique is so effective that it is still used today in many places where heavy machinery can't reach. Once the beams reached the height of the king's chamber, the hard part wasn't over. They needed to be positioned precisely inside the chamber itself. The entrance to the chamber wasn't large enough for workers to walk around casually with 8-ton beams under their arms, so they used a series of channels, passages, and ramps built inside the pyramid. These passageways were planned ahead of time, shaped to guide the beams into place. Imagine a team of workers inside the dim interior of the pyramid, using oil lamps to light the space, guiding one of these beams down a sloping corridor. The sound of granite scraping limestone echoed through the passage. The walls were close. The ceiling was low. Every movement had to be slow and deliberate. The workers communicated through shouts or short commands, careful not to panic or push too quickly. If the beam shifted sideways, it could get stuck. If it bumped the wall too hard, it could chip. Inside the king's chamber, The builders created a perfect rectangular space lined with granite. Above this room, they began stacking the huge granite beams, creating a layered ceiling. One beam at a time, they lifted the granite and placed it carefully. The beams sat side by side, tightly aligned, forming a ceiling strong enough to withstand the pressure of everything above. Then came the relieving chambers, small spaces stacked above the king's chamber, each with stones placed to redirect the weight of the pyramid. These chambers weren't made for people to stand in or admire. They were structural solutions designed to keep the chamber from crushing under the enormous pressure. Their ceilings alternated between flat and pointed stones, forming a system that directed weight away from the king's chamber and into the pyramid's core. Even today, standing inside these chambers feels surreal. The red ink markings left by workers, instructions, names, and placement notes still appear on the stones. They're reminders that real people built this structure. They measured these beams, they guided them, they lifted them, they placed them. No magic, no shortcuts, just planning, teamwork, tools, and sweat. The lifting of these enormous stones proves something important. The Egyptians didn't need impossible technology. They didn't need machines from the future. They used the simplest tools in the smartest ways possible. They broke big problems into small problems. They used ramps, levers, and teamwork. They took their time. They worked in stages. And slowly, steadily, piece by piece, they lifted a ceiling that still stands today. The massive, granite beams settling into place above the king's chamber weren't the final puzzle of the pyramid's interior. They were only part of a much more intricate design that the Egyptians had planned from the start. The outer pyramid, the giant, impressive triangle everyone sees, was only half the story. Deep inside the structure was another world, a hidden world of angled passages, narrow shafts, polished chamber walls, and secret architectural decisions made long before a single stone rose above ground level. Here, the engineering grows even more complex. If anything shows the Egyptians understood geometry, structure, and planning with near miraculous skill, it's the interior of the Great Pyramid. Work on these passages began at the same time as the foundation. You couldn't simply build the outer shell first and then try to carve tunnels inside it afterward. That would be like trying to hollow out a building while standing under its roof. Instead, the Egyptians built the inner passages at the same time the pyramid rose around them. The architecture had to be synchronized. Every chamber, corridor, and shaft had to appear at the right height, at the right angle, at the right point during construction. The first major corridor, the descending passage, was carved directly into the bedrock beneath the pyramid. It slopes downward at a very precise angle, leading into deeper parts of the structure. To carve this, workers had to measure carefully, cut straight lines through limestone, remove debris by hand, and polish surfaces until they matched the plan. Imagine descending into that first passage while it was still being carved. The sound of chisels echoing every few seconds, dust drifting in the lamplight, the air cool and still beneath the desert. Then there's the ascending passage, which branches upward from the descending one. Carving this upward angled corridor was incredibly difficult. Workers had to cut through thick limestone while maintaining a smooth slope, ensuring the corridor aligned perfectly with the grand gallery above it. If the angle shifted even slightly, it would throw off everything above. And the angles matter. The ascending passage rises at about 26 degrees, a precise incline. At some point during the construction, the builders blocked the lower end of the ascending passage with granite plugs. These giant stones were placed inside the pyramid during construction and slid down later to seal the corridor. They still sit there today, wedged tightly, blocking passage just as the architects intended. Their presence shows how the Egyptians planned ahead, not just for structural support, but for symbolic meaning. The pharaoh's burial chamber needed to be protected, sealed, and hidden. These granite plugs were part of that plan. At the top of the ascending passage lies the Grand Gallery, one of the most impressive architectural spaces of the ancient world. tall, narrow, and lined with corbelled stone layers that step inward as they rise. The grand gallery feels like a stone canyon carved with mathematical precision. Workers had to build ledges on each side, carefully placing stones so the walls leaned inward slightly, but remained perfectly stable. This wasn't just decoration. Those ledges once supported massive beams or sliders used to move stones into place. This room was both a functional engineering space and a symbolic pathway. While the gallery stretches upward, two more narrow shafts extend from the king's chamber, the so-called air shafts. These aren't wide enough for a person to crawl through. They are small, angular channels that exit on the pyramid's outer faces. For many years, people believed they were ventilation systems, but that doesn't make sense because the pyramid wasn't designed for the living. More likely, these shafts aligned to stars that were important in Egyptian religion. They allowed the pharaoh's soul, or his ka, to ascend towards specific constellations. Whether for symbolism or function, the shafts required careful planning. Their angles had to be exact. Their exit points had to match the outer layers of the pyramid. Carving such narrow channels through thick stone without deviations is an engineering achievement all by itself. Inside the queen's chamber, another mystery hides in the stonework. This chamber wasn't made for a queen at all. The name comes from early explorers, not ancient Egyptians. The true purpose of the room remains debated. Some believe it was an early burial chamber, abandoned as the plan changed. Others think it was symbolic, representing the womb from which the pharaoh would be reborn. And even here, small shafts similar to those in the king's chamber lead outward. These shafts stop abruptly, unfinished, hidden behind blocks. Why were they made? Why were they sealed? The builders left no explanation, only a puzzle carved into stone. Far below the queen's chamber lies the subterranean chamber, a rough, unfinished room carved deep into the bedrock. Workers carved a descending passage all the way down to this chamber before the pyramid rose above it. The chamber appears incomplete. Roughly cut walls, an uneven floor, and a feeling that the builders started something but changed their minds. Some archaeologists think it was an early burial chamber that was abandoned in favor of a higher one. Others believe it was always symbolic, representing the chaotic underworld. Whatever its meaning, carving a full chamber underground before constructing the pyramid above required incredible planning. The builders needed to know exactly how far down they could go without destabilizing the structure. Now, picture workers carving these passages in near darkness. Oil lamps flickered and smoked, filling the narrow corridors with the smell of burning oil. The temperature stayed cool underground, but the air grew thick with dust. A chisel struck the wall, then another, then another. The rhythm echoed through the stone. Small baskets filled with limestone chips were passed hand to hand and emptied outside the passages. Even moving debris required organization. For the smoother walls, workers polished the limestone with sandstone rubbers, water, and fine abrasives. That smoothness wasn't just decorative. It made it easier to slide blocks through the corridors when needed. In the grand gallery, smooth floors allowed workers to move huge stones up or down using wooden sleds or rollers. Every polished surface had a purpose. Markings inside these passages show us how carefully planned everything was. Builders drew red lines to guide cuts. They marked precise angles. They measured and remeasured. Geometry wasn't just something priests studied. It was a tool workers used every day. When modern architects measured the angles inside the pyramid, they found the deviations were tiny, often less than a half degree from perfection. For builders working in dim corridors with hand tools, this is astonishing. All these passages and chambers served a spiritual purpose, but they also reveal something deeply human. The workers who carved these spaces poured their skill into them, not just because they were ordered to, but because they believed the pharaoh's journey depended on their accuracy. Their craftsmanship ensured the king's passage into the afterlife. Each stroke of a chisel carried religious meaning. Each polished wall reflected their pride in their work. As the outer pyramid rose higher, the interior network of corridors and chambers evolved with it, adjusting to changes in design and function. Construction wasn't frozen in time. It adapted. The Egyptians weren't afraid to modify their plan if they believed it made the structure stronger, safer, or more symbolic. The interior of the Great Pyramid is proof not just of planning, but of the ability to rethink, revise, and refine. From the underground chamber to the king's chamber high above, the pyramid wasn't an empty monument. It was a layered architectural maze woven into the stone itself. And every twist, every turn, every angled shaft tells the story of builders who understood both engineering and eternity. While the interior passages took shape and the giant granite beams found their places above the king's chamber, life on the Giza plateau continued in a steady rhythm that kept the entire operation running. The pyramid didn't rise in isolation. It rose because a bustling world surrounded it, a world of ovens that never cooled, quarries that never slept, and people whose daily routines formed the heartbeat of the entire project. Far from the stereotype of suffering workers chained to stones, the laborers who built the pyramids lived in well-organized settlements near the construction site. Archaeologists uncovered these workers' villages in surprising detail. Long barracks for rotating crews, individual homes for permanent craftspeople, bakeries the size of small houses, breweries with enormous vats, medical centers, storage buildings, workshops, and wide courtyards where workers gathered before heading to their posts. These were real communities, built with purpose. The workers weren't a single group. Some stayed year-round: stonecutters, carpenters, rope makers, overseers, architects, and tool keepers. Others came seasonally, especially farmers who worked on construction projects during the Nile flood when their fields were underwater. For these farmers, pyramid work wasn't punishment. It was employment, social duty, and a chance to earn food, beer, clothing, and goods that supported their families. And the state needed them, because a project of this scale demanded thousands of hands during peak building phases. By sunrise, the village hummed like a hive. Workers woke before the desert heat turned the air heavy. The smell of baking bread filled the air. Round loaves baked in clay ovens, stacked and steaming. Bakers worked through the night to supply morning rations. Beer brewers stirred thick mixtures of barley, yeast, and water that bubbled inside giant ceramic vats. The ancient Egyptian beer wasn't like the bubbly drink people have today. It was dense, nutritious, and more like a liquid meal. But it provided energy, clean fluids, and, let's be honest, a friendlier mood during long hours of pulling stones uphill. Food wasn't fancy, but it was plentiful. Loaves of bread, dried fish, onions, dates, vegetables, and sometimes meat. Meat was special, reserved for skilled workers and special feast days. The bones of cattle, sheep, and goats found near the workers' quarters show that the people who built the pyramids ate far better than many of the poor across the ancient world. If someone could say they were eating like a pyramid builder, it was actually a compliment. After eating, crews gathered at designated meeting points. Each team had its own identity, its own supervisors, sometimes even its own slogans or names. Inscriptions found on pyramid stones reveal playful team labels, groups that referred to themselves as the Strong Friends, the Drunkards of Menkor, or the Vigorous Gang. These markings weren't graffiti left behind by bored workers. They were signs of team pride, the ancient equivalent of writing your construction crew's name on the beams of a new building. Supervisors checked attendance, handed out tasks, and coordinated with other teams. Then workers dispersed across the site. Some headed to the quarries, others to the ramps, others still into the pyramid's interior. Masons sharpened their tools. Rope makers twisted fresh fibers. Carpenters shaped sled runners and wooden levers. In the medical center, healers prepared bandages made of linen, and salves made from honey and herbs. Treatments that worked surprisingly well. Evidence of healed bones among the workers shows that injuries weren't ignored. They were treated, and treated with care. Out on the plateau, noise filled the air, the thud of copper chisels striking limestone, the crunch of stone chips swept into baskets, the grunts of rope teams leaning into their pulls, overseers shouting instructions, the occasional laughter drifting from a group taking a quick break. The work was intense, but the atmosphere wasn't silent or gloomy. It was alive. When midday approached and the sun pressed down hard, workers retreated to shade whenever possible. Some found rest behind large blocks, others under simple awnings made of wood and fiber mats. A break wasn't just a luxury. It was necessary. The desert sun was relentless. People drank water and beer to stay hydrated. They ate bread, sometimes dipped in beer or combined with onions for extra flavor. Some workers sat together trading jokes or complaining good-naturedly about who pulled too slowly that morning. These moments of rest restored energy for the second half of the day. As the afternoon cooled slightly, the ramps and quarries buzzed back to life. Stonecutters carved out new blocks. Teams hauled them to the waiting areas. Foremen inspected each stone before it was dragged up the ramps. If a block wasn't shaped correctly, it was sent back to the masons. Quality mattered more than speed. You don't build something that lasts thousands of years by saying, close enough. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps grew longer, or new ramps appeared in carefully planned positions. Workers adapted to the shifting layout. 1 month, they might pull sleds up a wide ramp leading to the second level. A few months later, the same ramp would be rebuilt or shifted, and workers would find themselves dragging stones up a different route. The flexibility of this system speaks to how well coordinated the entire project was. Thousands of people worked together almost like a single organism. Nearby, in workshops filled with dust and wood shavings, teams repaired tools after hours of heavy use. Copper chisels were reheated and hammered back into shape. Wooden tools were smoothed and strengthened. Rope was checked for wear, replaced if necessary. A snapped rope or a chipped lever could ruin an entire day's progress or cause an accident, so the support teams were as important as the workers on the ramps. At dusk, the desert cooled quickly. The sun dipped behind the plateau, and shadows stretched across the worksite. Workers walked back to the village in groups, tired but not miserable, talking as they stepped over the rocky ground. Fires were already burning in the courtyards. The smell of cooking filled the air again. People gathered in small groups, eating, drinking, and sharing stories of the day's mishaps. Stones that nearly slipped, ropes that held just in time, or chisels that refused to behave. Some evenings saw small celebrations. Music drifted through the settlement as workers clapped rhythms or played simple instruments. These weren't grand festivals, just small moments of relief after long days. The Egyptians valued balance, work balanced with rest, effort balanced with community. At night, the worksite fell quiet. The pyramid loomed against the starlit sky, a silhouette growing taller week by week. Lamps flickered in the unfinished corridors inside. A few specialists might still be there, checking measurements or preparing the next day's tasks. But most of the site slept. From the river, boats arrived under the glow of the moon, carrying fresh blocks of granite or shipments of food. The Nile was as much a worker as anyone else. Its waters made transport possible, linking everything together: quarries, villages, temples, workshops, and the rising pyramid. The daily rhythm never stopped for long. One day flowed into the next. The pyramid rose slowly but steadily, each new layer reflecting the lives, routines, and determination of the people below. They built the structure not in heroic moments, but in countless ordinary days filled with sweat, laughter, tools sharpening in the dark, bread baking at dawn, and teamwork that stretched across the desert like an invisible thread. While the workers hauled blocks, and the village thrummed with daily life. Another world shaped the fate of the pyramid, a world of priests, astronomers, scribes, and the pharaoh himself. The pyramid wasn't just an enormous construction project, it was a sacred mission, a spiritual engine meant to carry the pharaoh into the afterlife and secure the prosperity of the entire kingdom. Everything built on the plateau, from the greatest granite beam to the smallest chiseled mark, existed because of a belief system that wove together power, religion, and eternity. From the very beginning, the pharaoh wasn't just a ruler. He was considered the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god who watched over the skies. Upon his death, he would become Osiris, ruler of the afterlife. This transition from king to divine being was central to Egyptian religion, and the pyramid existed to make that transformation possible. Without the right structure, the right rituals, and the right alignment with the heavens, the pharaoh's journey could falter, and with it, the harmony of the entire cosmos. This belief didn't sit quietly in a temple. It influenced everything: architecture, labor schedules, orientation, materials, and the placement of every chamber inside the pyramid. Even the workers who dragged stones under the desert sun knew the project wasn't merely practical. They were building the resting place of the king who connected mortal life to the gods. Their work mattered not just because it pleased the pharaoh, but because it protected their future, their families, and the stability of Egypt itself. In the heart of this spiritual framework were the priests. They didn't swing chisels or drag sleds, but they oversaw rituals, interpreted omens, calculated star alignments, and confirmed auspicious dates for different phases of construction. If a priest declared that the stars aligned favorably, workers began a new section of the pyramid. If the omens suggested caution, progress might pause until the divine signals improved. These decisions weren't based on guesswork. Priests were trained in astronomy, mathematics, and the complex symbolic language of Egyptian religion. They knew how to track the movements of the stars that guided the soul of the king. One of the most important celestial markers was the circumpolar stars, the ones that never set. To the Egyptians, these eternal stars represented the unending afterlife. Aligning the pyramid with these stars wasn't symbolic, it was functional. The shafts in the king's chamber point toward them, creating a spiritual passageway through which the pharaoh's soul could ascend. To get this alignment right, priests spent nights observing the sky, marking the position of stars using sighting rods, and communicating their findings to the architects. The architects, in turn, worked closely with scribes, the educated officials who recorded everything. Scribes documented stone deliveries, labor rosters, measurements, and religious instructions. They were the bridge between the physical and the spiritual sides of the project. Their records ensured that the vision of the priests aligned with the precision of the builders. The pharaoh himself wasn't just a distant figure sitting on a throne in Memphis. He visited the construction site, inspected progress, and offered blessings to the workers. His presence wasn't casual. When the pharaoh arrived, it symbolized divine approval. His appearance inspired the workers, reinforced the importance of the mission, and affirmed that their efforts were seen not only by him, but by the gods watching over him. Imagine the scene. The workers pause as a royal procession approaches. Dust settles as guards form lines. Priests walk ahead, holding incense and sacred symbols. And finally, the pharaoh appears, wearing a headdress that shines under the desert sun. He steps forward, touches a foundation stone, or addresses the gathered crews with measured words. To a worker who spends days hauling limestone blocks, this moment must have felt like confirmation that their sweat and strength carried the weight of the kingdom. The pharaoh's role extended beyond ceremonial visits. He appointed the overseers, approved the final architectural plan, and ensured resources flowed steadily to Giza. Grain, cattle, copper for tools, wood for sleds, rope from across the Nile Valley. All of it came because the pharaoh ordered it. A pyramid wasn't built by accident. It was built by the will of the king, supported by the administration of the state. And then there were the temples connected to the pyramid complex. At the foot of the pyramid sat the mortuary temple, where priests would perform rituals after the pharaoh's death. Farther down the causeway, the valley temple served as the ceremonial entrance, linking the pyramid to the river. These temples weren't afterthoughts. They were designed alongside the pyramid, forming a sacred landscape that guided the journey from life to death and into the afterlife. Workers also constructed the causeway, a long sloping road decorated with carved reliefs and symbolic scenes. This causeway wasn't just a passage, it was a grand ceremonial path used in funerary processions. When the pharaoh died, his body would travel from the valley temple up the causeway to the pyramid, accompanied by priests, officials, and sacred rituals. Every step of that journey was planned long before the pyramid was complete. It's important to understand that to the Egyptians, death wasn't an end. It was a transition. The pyramid was a machine for resurrection, designed to ensure the king rose again with the sun each morning. The pyramid's shape mirrored the sun's rays descending to earth. Each morning, when sunlight touched the polished limestone casing of the pyramid, it reflected a blinding brilliance. This flash of light symbolized the sun god lifting the pharaoh toward eternal life. This spiritual purpose made the construction more than labor. It gave meaning to every detail. When workers carved smooth surfaces inside the passages, they weren't just finishing walls. They were preparing a pathway for the king's soul. When astronomers checked the alignment with the stars, they weren't simply making geometric calculations. They were opening doors between worlds. When priests performed rituals at the construction site, they weren't offering empty gestures. They were keeping the cosmic order intact. The religious foundation of the pyramid also reinforced social unity. Thousands of people across Egypt, farmers, craftsmen, traders, officials, contributed materials, labor, or goods for the project. The pyramid wasn't one man's monument. It was a national endeavor rooted in shared belief. Everyone understood that if the pharaoh's soul reached the afterlife, he would protect Egypt, ensure the flooding of the Nile, and keep the land fertile. Even the workers' graffiti, the playful team names carved on stones, fit into this spiritual landscape. They show pride, identity, and belonging. A worker wasn't just dragging blocks. He was part of the Strong Friends, or the Vigorous Gang, a small community inside the larger mission. These marks reveal humor, camaraderie, and humanity, proof that even in the shadow of great beginnings, people found ways to make the work their own. And so, every hammer strike, every measured rope length, every stone polished smooth, had a purpose rooted in belief. The pyramid wasn't just built from stone, it was built from faith. Faith that the world made sense, that the gods watched over Egypt, and that the pharaoh's eternal life depended on the people who labored in the dust and sun of Giza. By the time the inner chambers were secured, the passages polished, and the king's chamber sealed with its massive granite beams, the outer body of the pyramid had grown so high that standing near its base made the top look almost unreachable. The structure that had begun as a flat, marked-out square on the plateau was now a towering geometric mountain. But it wasn't finished. Not even close. The raw, stepped appearance of the pyramid at this stage looked nothing like the smooth, gleaming monument we imagine today. What we picture now, that perfect triangular shape catching the sun, didn't exist until one of the most meticulous stages of construction began, placing the outer casing. The casing stones were crafted from fine white limestone quarried at Tura, across the river from Giza. This limestone was prized for its bright, almost golden white appearance. When freshly cut and polished, it shone brilliantly under the sun. The Egyptians understood that this shine wasn't just beautiful, it carried religious significance. The pyramid, in its finished state, would reflect sunlight like a beacon. To anyone approaching the Nile Valley, the structure would appear as if made of light itself, a symbolic link between the pharaoh and the sun god Ra. Transporting these casing stones was a massive undertaking. Though lighter than the granite used in the king's chamber, the outer limestone blocks still weighed several tons each. Boats carried them from Tura across the Nile, workers unloaded them onto sleds, and teams dragged them to the pyramid's base using the same coordination and hauling rhythms perfected during earlier stages. Yet these stones demanded even more precision. They weren't simply blocks. They were angled faces meant to fit together seamlessly and create the pyramid's slope. Before placing the casing stones, masons shaped them with careful angles so they would sit tightly against one another. The angle wasn't arbitrary. It matched the intended slope of the pyramid exactly. If even one stone was angled incorrectly, it could disrupt the alignment of the entire outer face. The process required a combination of geometry, craftsmanship, and patience, the kind of patience only people who fully understand the importance of their work can muster. Imagine workers lifting one of these casing stones up a ramp, surrounded by the rising desert heat. Sweat darkened their linen garments. Dust clung to their arms. The shouts of the overseers guided the puller's rhythm. Slowly, carefully, the stone slid up the incline. As it neared its final position, masons waited with tools in hand, ready to trim edges or smooth surfaces as needed. When the stone reached its place, teams shifted it with levers, inch by inch, until it fit into the line of stones already placed beside it. One of the most astonishing parts of this process is how well the Egyptians smoothed the outer surface. Once a section of casing stones was in place, workers polished them using sandstone rubbers, sand, and water. Over time, the outer surface transformed into a smooth plane that would catch the sunlight. After enough stones were polished, the entire face of the pyramid gleamed like a single piece of solid limestone. People often imagine workers dangling from ropes to polish the outer surface, but the Egyptians likely flattened their working space as they went. As they finished a layer of casing stones, they would move upward, adjusting ramps or platforms to reach the next layer. No one had to dangle dangerously from the pyramid's peak, the way modern restoration workers do today. As the pyramid approached its full height, the layers became smaller. The topmost steps required fewer stones, and the remaining space narrowed dramatically. The tension must have grown noticeably. Workers were aware that the upper layers needed to be perfectly aligned. Even a small deviation near the top would distort the shape. They worked more slowly, checking angles, consulting architects, and adjusting stones with greater caution. At the summit, the final milestone awaited, placing the capstone. This stone, called the pyramidion, was more than just the final piece. It symbolized the completion of the pharaoh's eternal home. Some scholars believe the pyramidion was covered in gold leaf or electrum, an alloy of gold and silver that gleamed brilliantly. If true, the top of the Great Pyramid would have caught the earliest rays of sunrise and the last glow of sunset, shining like a star fallen to the desert floor. Imagine the moment the capstone rose on its sled. Workers pulled with all their strength. Supervisors shouted instructions. The stone crept up the final ramp, small in comparison to the rest of the pyramid, but vital in meaning. Once it reached the top platform, masons guided it into position. There must have been a collective breath held in the air as the final stone settled, completing a structure built by tens of thousands of hands over decades. With the capstone in place, the energy on the plateau changed. The great challenge had been conquered. The physical form of the pharaoh's eternal mansion stood complete. But the work wasn't finished yet. There was still the matter of the causeway, the mortuary temple, the valley temple, and final smoothing that continued even after the pharaoh's burial preparations had begun. The pyramid was the centerpiece, but the surrounding complex completed the sacred landscape. The causeway connecting the valley temple to the mortuary temple stretched across the plateau, angled and decorated with reliefs. Workers carved scenes onto the walls, images of the pharaoh, depictions of religious rituals, and symbols of the journey to the afterlife. The causeway was both a road and a story, guiding the funeral procession from the Nile's edge to the foot of the pyramid. Inside the mortuary temple, another team of sculptors and relief carvers worked tirelessly. They shaped statues, decorated walls, and constructed altars where priests would perform offerings for the pharaoh long after he had passed into the afterlife. These temples were essential. Without continual rituals, the pharaoh's journey couldn't be maintained. Even in death, a king needed attention. Across the site, workers continued to polish and refine the pyramid's exterior. The stone cutters and masons, who had shaped coarse blocks months or years earlier, now took pride in the gleaming surface forming under their hands. When the sun hit the smooth limestone, it radiated light so intensely that it could be seen from miles away. Travelers approaching the Nile Valley would glimpse the pyramid shimmering on the horizon, its clean, angled faces catching the sky. Overseers walked the length of each face, checking for imperfections, marking places that needed smoothing, and organizing teams to handle small adjustments. Even after the main construction was finished, the pyramid required care, like a monumental sculpture being fine-tuned for its final reveal. Around this time, preparations began for the pharaoh's burial. The completion of the pyramid wasn't just architectural, it was ceremonial. Priests performed rituals on platforms built beside the pyramid, blessing tools, offerings, and sacred objects destined for the burial chamber. Artisans crafted chests, shrines, canopic jars, amulets, and funerary goods that would accompany the pharaoh into the afterlife. All of these items flowed into the pyramid complex like the final pieces of a vast ritual puzzle. The workers who had spent years shaping, dragging, lifting, and polishing now watched the final details come together. Some of them probably felt awe seeing the pyramid in its finished form. Others may have felt exhausted relief. Some might have joked about finally being able to sleep past sunrise, but all of them knew they had helped create something that would last longer than their own lives. Something that would continue long after their children and grandchildren walked the earth. Even today, although the smooth casing has mostly fallen away and the capstone is long gone, people stand before the Great Pyramid and imagine what it once looked like fully finished. A gleaming triangle rising from the desert, flawless and bright, reflecting the sun like a giant mirror, crowned with a shining capstone that sparkled at dawn. The final layers weren't just the end of construction. They were the completion of a promise. A promise that the pharaoh would rise with the sun, cross the sky, descend with the stars, and live forever in the eternal cycle Egypt believed held the world together. As the final casing stones settled into their polished brightness, and the capstone took its throne at the pinnacle of the pyramid, the atmosphere around Giza shifted. The thunder of daily construction began to quiet. The frantic pace that had driven years of lifting, shaping, dragging, and aligning slowly gave way to something more controlled, more careful, almost ceremonial in its stillness. The great structure stood complete in form, but the work was not finished. A project of this magnitude needed refinement, organization, and transformation from an active site of labor into the sacred complex it was always intended to become. The first major change came with the removal of the ramps. For years, these ramps had been lifelines, pathways that carried the stones upward, allowed teams to move tools and materials efficiently, and connected the highest courses to the ground below. But now, they blocked the view of the finished faces. Workers began dismantling them methodically. Teams scraped away compacted earth, carried off stones used in the ramp walls, and leveled the ground around the base of the pyramid. The structure that had been slowly revealed through decades of work now stood fully exposed for the first time, its sides perfectly angled and gleaming under the desert sun. This must have been a moment of realization for many workers. For so long, their focus had been narrow, one stone at a time, one day at a time, one course at a time. Now, as the ramps disappeared, the entire scale of their work became visible. The pyramid rose from the plateau with clean, straight geometry that seemed almost impossible to the human eye. Even people who had dragged blocks for years likely found themselves staring upward in a kind of quiet astonishment. With the ramps cleared, the next task was refining the pyramid's exterior. The process of smoothing and polishing wasn't complete when the last stone was placed. Masons climbed onto temporary platforms to inspect the casing stones, checking for any misalignments or rough patches. They used sandstone rubbers, water, and fine abrasives to even out surfaces and blend edges. This wasn't just practical work. It had symbolic weight. A smooth, bright exterior represented perfection, order, and the eternal stability the pharaoh's tomb was meant to embody. While this careful finishing continued on the outer face, activity within the pyramid and in the surrounding buildings intensified. The interior, already cut and shaped with precision, needed final preparations before the pharaoh could be laid to rest. Priests moved through the corridors, performing purification rituals. They burned incense, sprinkled water, and recited prayers meant to cleanse the passageways and chambers. Their voices echoed softly against polished stone walls, weaving ancient words into the architecture itself. Artisans, too, played an essential role at this stage. They created items that would accompany the pharaoh into the afterlife: stone vessels, wooden chests, ceremonial tools, amulets, linen garments, and objects of symbolic importance. Each item held meaning. Some were placed to provide comfort. Others offered protection. Many represented the power and identity of the king. Even though the Great Pyramid did not contain elaborate wall carvings like later royal tombs, its burial goods were crafted with the same seriousness. Around the pyramid, the broader complex neared completion. The causeway stretching from the mortuary temple to the valley temple received its final touches. Workers leveled the pathway, smoothed surfaces, and checked the alignment. Sculptors added reliefs to the walls where appropriate, depicting the pharaoh, religious symbols, or scenes tied to rituals. Though weather and time have erased much of this decoration, the scale and care of the causeway's construction suggest it once formed a grand ceremonial route. Inside the mortuary temple, activity increased. This building, attached to the pyramid's eastern face, was essential to the pharaoh's eternal journey. Here, offerings would be made daily to sustain the king's spirit. Workers placed stone slabs for altars, installed basins for purification, and prepared storage spaces for offerings. Relief carvers finished details on pillars and walls. Priests rehearsed rituals that would be performed long after the burial itself, ensuring continuity between the living world and the afterlife. Meanwhile, the workers' village began to change. People who had lived near the site for years began returning to their home regions once their tasks were complete. Farmers returned to their fields when the Nile's floodwaters retreated. Craftsmen traveled to other royal projects. Some stayed behind to assist with the remaining temples or to maintain the site in its early years. Slowly, the lively settlement that had once been filled with the noise of daily labor quieted as its purpose shifted. Scribes documented everything. Their records described the number of stones used, the delivery of materials, the teams who completed key sections, and the status of the surrounding structures. They noted inventories of tools, lists of goods destined for the burial chamber, and the organization of priests and officials. These records weren't mere paperwork. They preserved the orderliness of a project that symbolized cosmic stability. In Egyptian belief, to record something was to define it, to bind it into the structure of truth. Outside, teams continued to tidy the plateau. They cleared leftover chips of limestone, filled small pits left from construction, and organized areas around the pyramid into designated pathways and ceremonial grounds. Every space needed to reflect the purpose it served. Disorder would have contradicted the very reason the pyramid existed. This stage of the process felt different from the years of heavy lifting and stone dragging. The pace was slower, more deliberate. Workers now moved with awareness that the place they walked was transitioning into sacred ground. With every stone cleaned, every passage purified, Every item placed with intention, the complex transformed from a construction site into a spiritual landscape. As the finishing work drew to a close, the pyramid and its surrounding temples began to take on a unified appearance. The polished limestone casing made the pyramid glow under the sun, while the causeway connected the valley temple to the mortuary temple like a ceremonial thread. The air on the plateau grew quieter. The shouts of laborers faded. The clatter of tools diminished. In their place came the measured movements of priests preparing for the burial rituals. The workers who remained must have sensed the change deeply. For years, their efforts had been focused outward, lifting, cutting, shaping. Now, the energy turned inward, toward meaning, ritual, and transition. The pyramid no longer demanded strength. It demanded reverence. By the time the preparations neared completion, the Great Pyramid stood not just as a marvel of engineering, but as a complete ceremonial machine, aligned with the stars, shaped with mathematical precision, furnished with offerings, purified by rituals, and ready to receive a king. As the final preparations settled into place, the plateau took on a heavy stillness, not the quiet of completion, but the quiet before ceremony. For years, the pyramid had been a place of noise, tools striking stone, sled runners scraping over ramps, the constant movement of thousands of workers shaping the monument day after day. Now the sounds had softened, replaced by the low murmur of priests preparing rituals, the shuffle of officials carrying sacred objects, and the calm anticipation of what the entire project had been leading toward, the pharaoh's final journey. When the news spread that the king had died, the kingdom entered a period of mourning. The pharaoh's death was not merely the departure of a ruler. It was a cosmic event. His passing meant the earthly form of Horus was gone, and the transition toward becoming Osiris, lord of the afterlife, began. This transformation required rituals as detailed and carefully ordered as the construction of the pyramid itself. Every part of the funeral ceremony carried meaning, guiding the king from the world of the living to his eternal role among the gods. The body of the pharaoh was prepared with great care. Embalmers washed it, wrapped it in linen, and adorned it with amulets placed at specific points for protection. The process was accompanied by prayers and hymns that echoed through embalming halls. Sacred oils anointed the body. The wrapping was methodical, layer upon layer, each serving a purpose. For those present, this was not an ordinary act. It was the shaping of a divine form meant to endure forever. When the preparations were complete, the priests, officials, and royal family gathered for the procession to the pyramid. The day was chosen with astronomical consideration, aligning the burial with celestial cycles. The procession began at the Valley Temple near the Nile, where the body of the pharaoh rested before its final journey. The temple had been built specifically for this purpose, a place of purification, prayer, and preparation before the ascent to the pyramid. The Valley Temple, though now worn by time, once stood firmly against the desert, constructed with massive blocks of limestone and granite. Within its halls, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, a vital ritual intended to restore the king's senses so he could breathe, see, speak, and eat in the afterlife. Without this ritual, the pharaoh's spirit could not function in the next world. Every word spoken, every gesture made, followed an ancient order passed down by priests trained for decades. When the ceremony concluded, the procession began its passage up the long, sloping causeway, connecting the Valley Temple to the pyramid's mortuary temple. This causeway, built in tandem with the pyramid itself, was more than a path. It was a symbolic bridge between the earthly world and the eternal one. Along its walls were scenes and inscriptions that reminded all who walked there of the pharaoh's life, his divine role, and the cosmic order he upheld. The coffin, carried by a team of priests, moved slowly. Officials walked beside them, some holding standards topped with sacred symbols, others carrying offerings or ritually important objects. Musicians played flutes and drums in slow, steady rhythms that matched the pace of the procession. The air was filled with incense. The scent drifted upward, carried by the desert wind as the procession continued. Workers who had spent years building the pyramid stood along the edges of the causeway. They did not take part in the rituals, but they watched with quiet reverence. They had shaped the stones the coffin would soon pass through. They had built the chambers where the king would rest. Many of them had dedicated decades of their lives to the project. Seeing the pharaoh's body move toward the structure must have felt like witnessing the final purpose of everything they had done. When the procession reached the mortuary temple at the base of the pyramid, the atmosphere changed again. This temple, attached directly to the eastern face of the structure, was where offerings would continue for generations. Inside its halls, priests placed the coffin on a ceremonial platform. More rituals followed: prayers, libations, chants meant to guide the pharaoh through the coming stages of his journey. After these rites, the coffin was moved to the entrance of the pyramid itself. The passages, purified in advance, echoed faintly with the sound of footsteps and soft chants. Torches held by priests cast warm light across the smooth stone surfaces. The air inside the pyramid was cool, still, and heavy with meaning. For the first time, the chambers were receiving the one for whom they had been built. The coffin traveled through the ascending passage, up the grand gallery, and into the king's chamber. The long, polished corridor amplified every sound: the rustle of linen, the shuffle of sandals, the quiet breaths of those carrying the body. The journey upward mirrored the symbolic rising of the king from death toward rebirth. Inside the king's chamber, the granite sarcophagus waited. The stone chest, carved long before the pyramid reached its final height, was positioned with such precision that it still sits there today, unmoved by thousands of years. The coffin was lowered carefully into the sarcophagus. It was a moment that combined precision with reverence. One mistake could damage the coffin or the chamber, so every movement was deliberate. Next came the placement of burial goods, items meant to sustain the pharaoh in the afterlife. Priests placed jars of oils, chest boxes, symbolic tools, small statues and offerings around the sarcophagus. Though the Great Pyramid lacked the painted scenes found in later tombs, these objects formed a kind of story, a quiet expression of belief and preparation. When everything was set, the priests performed the final rituals. They recited hymns invoking Osiris, Ra, and other gods. They lit incense and offered food. They spoke the king's names, ensuring his identity would endure eternally. The words echoed in the chamber, mingling with the warmth of the torchlight and the cold permanence of granite. Then the moment came to seal the chamber. Workers placed massive granite blocks into the passageways behind the priests, sliding them into position using levers and ramps built specifically for this purpose. Each block, once in place, filled the corridor with an immovable barrier. These blocks weren't intended to be opened again. Their purpose was protection, to keep the king undisturbed, untouched, and whole in his eternal home. As the final stone sealed the ascending passage and the last lights faded behind the new barrier, the interior of the pyramid went dark. Absolute darkness, a silence so complete that no echo could return. For the first time since construction began, the pyramid was no longer a work site. It was a tomb, a sacred container holding the body of a king and the hopes of a nation. Outside, the priests concluded the remaining funerary rituals in the mortuary temple. They lit incense, offered bread and beer, and dedicated the space to its ongoing purpose: to nourish the king's spirit through daily offerings, performed by generations of priests yet to come. And as the sun set on that day, the pyramid stood exactly as it had been designed to stand, aligned with the stars, glowing beneath the fading light, and filled with a presence that would never again be witnessed by the living. After the final rituals ended, and the king's chamber was sealed in darkness, the plateau began to settle into a new kind of silence. It wasn't the hush of completion or the quiet of abandonment, but something in between. The stillness of a place shifting from human hands to timeless purpose. The pyramid, once surrounded by the constant movement of Workers and the layered sounds of construction now stood alone in its finished form, steady and unchanging against the rising and falling desert winds. Even though the heart of the pyramid had been sealed, the complex around it remained alive with activity for some time. Priests continued to perform daily offerings in the mortuary temple, carrying bread, beer, incense, and ritual words through the halls as they maintained the pharaoh's spiritual sustenance. Scribes documented these rituals. Officials oversaw the storage of offerings. Guards ensured the sacred grounds were respected. Life still pulsed through the structures built to honor the king, but gradually, the necessity for a bustling support community began to diminish. Many of the workers who had remained to see the final rites returned to their home villages or were reassigned to other projects throughout the kingdom. Egypt was always building temples, tombs, canals, statues, and the skills learned on the Giza plateau would continue shaping monuments across the land. The pyramid builders carried their experience elsewhere, spreading knowledge of stone, geometry, and teamwork to future generations. The workers' village near the pyramid shifted from a construction hub to a support settlement with a far smaller population. Some families stayed behind to tend to the priests, to watch over the complex, or to maintain the pathways and structures that needed care. But the echoes of the thousands who had once lived there slowly faded as the years passed. What remained were traces of their daily habits: the bread ovens, the broken pottery, the tools left behind, and the bones of animals that had fed them. These quiet artifacts would one day tell archaeologists as much about the people as the pyramid itself told about power and belief. With fewer voices on the plateau, the pyramid's presence grew stronger. There is something in its silence that carries the weight of intention. Its smooth outer casing reflected the sun with such brilliance that travelers approaching the Nile Valley would see its glow from a great distance. Some described it as a mountain carved by human hands. Others saw it as an anchor of light in the desert, a sentinel of stability watching over the land. In this completed state, the pyramid became what it had always been intended to be: a bridge between heaven and earth. The alignment with the stars, the carefully angled sides, the ascending passages, all were designed with the belief that the king's spirit would rise through the structure and join the celestial realm. The pyramid wasn't just stone, it was a pathway, a symbolic machine, continuing to function long after the builders had walked away. The people of Egypt didn't view the pyramid as a monument frozen in time. They saw it as part of a continuum. Generations of priests performed rituals at the mortuary temple. Offerings were delivered daily. Ceremonies echoed along the causeway. The pharaoh's presence remained invisible but significant, believed to influence the flood of the Nile, the fertility of the land, and the well-being of the kingdom. As long as the rituals continued, the king lived on in the unseen world. Beyond the priesthood, the pyramid shaped the landscape around it. Merchants passed it on their journeys. Families pointed to it as a symbol of the kingdom's strength. Children growing up in nearby villages saw it as a natural part of the horizon, though likely with a sense of awe. The structure stood as a kind of eternal companion to the daily life of the valley. Over time, however, as dynasties shifted and new kings built new monuments in other regions, the frequency of rituals at the older pyramids decreased. Resources moved to newer complexes. The mortuary temples, once filled with activity, gradually quieted. Eventually, the daily offerings faded into memory, interrupted only by occasional ceremonies that linked back to older traditions. The great limestone casing, once shining like polished ivory, began to weather. Storms, winds, and centuries of shifting sands softened its perfection. Some stones loosened over time. Earthquakes in later centuries loosened more. Stripped casing blocks were eventually taken for building in medieval periods, revealing the rough core beneath, the layers of stone that modern visitors see today. Yet even stripped of its outer glow, the core of the pyramid remained remarkably strong. The precision of its original construction preserved its shape even when parts of it were removed. And thousands of years after the workers smoothed the final casing stones, people still found themselves standing at the base of the pyramid, looking up with the same disbelief the ancient builders might have felt when the ramps were finally gone. The pyramid's endurance shaped the world's understanding of ancient Egypt. Travelers in the classical period wrote about it with wonder. Scholars in medieval times debated how it could have been built. Explorers in later centuries climbed its sides to measure its angles. Modern archaeologists uncovered the workers' villages, the tools, the food remains, and the graffiti that revealed the very human story behind the structure. All of this, every rediscovery, every excavation, every moment of awe, adds to the pyramid's legacy. Its survival surpasses the ambitions of its creators. What the builders meant to last for eternity has indeed outlived empires, languages, religions, and borders. The world that surrounded the pyramid in its early years faded, yet the monument stayed rooted in the desert, a constant among changing times. Even now, the Great Pyramid moves people in ways its builders could never have predicted. Standing before it, countless visitors feel an immediate connection to the past, a quiet recognition that humans with simple tools and shared purpose once shaped something far beyond the scale of ordinary life. If the workers who lived and labored on the Giza Plateau could see the future, they would perhaps be surprised to know their project still stands, still inspires, still challenges imagination. They might not recognize the world around it, but they would recognize the core of what they built: the precision, the scale, the alignment, and the belief that guided every stone. The Great Pyramid is no longer polished. Its casing is mostly gone. Its capstone is missing. Yet what remains is still enough to make the desert seem smaller, the sky seem closer, and human capability seem far greater than anyone might assume at a glance. And so the story of its construction comes to rest where the workers once stood, at the foot of a monument built with steady hands, determined minds, and a vision that carried beyond a single lifetime. If you've reached this point, with your eyes heavy and your breath softening, I hope this story helped you unwind. Thank you for listening, and may the quiet of the night carry you the rest of the way into sleep. Good night.